Which, "You should have never come," my daughter-in-law shouted across the restaurant. And in that instant, every conversation around us seemed to fade into silence. I looked down at the remains of my dinner scattered across the floor beside my table, and then slowly lifted my eyes to hers. Vanessa Carter stood there breathing hard, her face tight with anger. Around us, dozens of people stared. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked curious. A few pretended not to notice at all. My son Ryan sat frozen in his chair, staring at the tablecloth as if it contained the answer to a question he didn't want to face. I could have defended myself. I could have demanded an explanation. Instead, I reached for my purse, stood up carefully, and offered the smallest smile. They thought they had finally humiliated me. They thought this was the moment I would break. They were wrong. Looking back now, I realized the evening had been strange long before I arrived. Earlier that morning, I had received a phone call from Ryan. We hadn't spoken much in recent months, so hearing his voice brought a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. He told me the family was gathering at a popular restaurant downtown and said it would mean a lot if I came. Those words stayed with me all day. It would mean a lot if I came. After months of canceled visits, missed birthdays, and unanswered messages, I allowed myself to believe things were changing. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for nearly 20 minutes deciding what to wear. At 71, I no longer worried about fashion, but I still cared about dignity. I chose a navy blue dress and a pearl necklace my late husband had given me on our 30th wedding anniversary. As I fastened the clasp behind my neck, I found myself smiling. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful. The drive into town took about 30 minutes. Along the way, I passed familiar places that carried memories of better years. The grocery store where Ryan used to beg for candy when he was 8. The park where my husband taught him to ride a bicycle. The church where our family once sat together every Sunday morning. Those memories felt distant now, like photographs left too long in the sun. By the time I arrived at the restaurant, the parking lot was already full. Through the windows, I could see people laughing beneath warm lights. Families gathered around tables. Children running between chairs. For a moment, I felt grateful simply to be included. A hostess greeted me and led me toward the private dining area where Ryan and Vanessa were waiting. The moment I entered, something felt wrong. Conversations stopped for a fraction of a second. A few relatives exchanged quick glances. Vanessa's smile appeared forced. Ryan barely looked up from his phone. I told myself I was imagining things. I had become too sensitive, too lonely, too eager for signs that weren't really there. Dinner began politely enough. Orders were placed. Drinks arrived. People discussed vacations, promotions, and school events. I listened more than I spoke. No one asked about my life. No one mentioned how I had been doing since losing my husband 3 years earlier. Still, I remained pleasant. Then came the moment that changed everything. One simple comment from me about a family tradition triggered a reaction I never expected. Vanessa's expression hardened. Her voice rose. Before anyone could intervene, she lashed out with words sharp enough to silence the entire room. And as every eye turned toward me, I finally understood something I had refused to see for far too long. This dinner had never been about bringing the family together. It had been about sending me a message. The question was why. And before the night was over, I intended to find out. I left the restaurant that night with my head held high, but the drive home felt longer than usual. The city lights blurred beyond my windshield as questions circled endlessly through my mind. For months I had convinced myself that distance within a family could happen naturally. People became busy. Lives changed. Priorities shifted. That was what I had told myself every time Ryan forgot to call. Every time a holiday invitation arrived late. Every time I learned about a family gathering through social media instead of a personal invitation. Yet sitting alone in my living room later that evening, I could no longer pretend. Those moments were unrelated. The silence inside my house felt familiar. 3 years had passed since my husband, Thomas, died, but some nights the emptiness still surprised me. His favorite chair remained beside the fireplace. His old reading glasses still sat in the top drawer of the end table because I had never found the courage to move them. I walked slowly through the house, turning on lamps one by one. Warm light filled the rooms, but it could not chase away the feeling growing inside me. Something had changed long before that dinner. I simply had not wanted to see it. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Sleep had come in short fragments. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching the first light spread across the neighborhood. Years ago, Ryan used to sit at this very table before school. He would eat pancakes while telling me stories about his dreams or plans for the future. Back then, he shared everything with me. Somewhere along the way, those conversations disappeared. I began thinking about small moments that once seemed insignificant. Last Christmas, Vanessa insisted they celebrate at her parents' house. Ryan promised to visit afterward, but never came. On my 70th birthday, they mailed flowers instead of attending dinner. When my doctor recommended a minor medical procedure last year, Ryan texted to ask how it went, but never called. Each memory felt like another piece of a puzzle slowly falling into place. By noon, I found myself opening old photo albums. There was Ryan at age 10 holding a baseball trophy. Ryan at 18 wearing his graduation cap. Ryan standing beside Vanessa on their wedding day. I studied that photograph for a long time. I remembered how happy I had been when she joined our family. I welcomed her with complete trust. I defended her whenever relatives complained about her sharp personality. I believed patience and kindness could build any bridge. Looking at that picture now, I wondered if I had ignored warning signs from the beginning. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. For a moment, I thought it might be Ryan. Instead, it was my niece Claire. Her voice sounded hesitant. She asked if I was doing all right. The question caught me off guard. Claire rarely called during the workday. After a brief pause, she admitted she had heard about the restaurant incident from another relative. I expected sympathy. What I received was something else entirely. Claire lowered her voice and told me there had been conversations happening behind my back for months. Family discussions, financial discussions, discussions involving my future. My heart began beating faster. She did not know every detail, but she knew enough to make one thing clear. The dinner had not been an emotional outburst. It had been part of something larger. After ending the call, I sat perfectly still at my kitchen table. The afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floor. Outside, children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Everything looked normal. Everything felt normal. Yet for the first time, I realized that while I had been grieving the loss of my husband, someone else had been quietly reshaping my place within the family. And if Claire was right, the humiliation at the restaurant was only the beginning. The rest of that week passed in a haze of unanswered questions. I tried to focus on ordinary routines. I watered the flowers on my front porch. I visited the grocery store on Thursday morning. I attended church on Sunday. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. Inside, however, something had shifted. Claire's warning refused to leave my mind. The more I thought about it, the more details resurfaced. Small details. The kind people overlook until they suddenly form a pattern. 2 months earlier, Ryan had asked unusual questions about the house. He wanted to know whether I had considered downsizing. A few weeks after that, Vanessa had casually mentioned retirement communities during dinner. At the time, I thought she was simply making conversation. Now those comments felt different. Deliberate. Planned. The following Tuesday, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. Around noon, I drove into town to meet an old friend for lunch. While waiting for a table, I noticed Ryan's car parked across the street. That alone was not unusual. His office was nearby. What caught my attention was seeing Vanessa step out of the passenger side. She was not alone. A man in an expensive suit greeted her warmly outside a law office. They shook hands and entered the building together. Something about the scene unsettled me. I remained where I was, staring through the restaurant window long after they disappeared inside. Later that afternoon, curiosity overcame caution. I called a former colleague of my late husband, a man named Richard Hale. Richard had worked closely with Thomas for more than 20 years and still maintained connections throughout the city. I trusted him. More importantly, Thomas trusted him. When I explained what had happened at the restaurant, Richard grew unusually quiet. Then he asked a question that made my stomach tighten. "Evelyn, has anyone recently discussed the family trust with you?" I nearly dropped the phone. The family trust was something I had not heard mentioned in years. Thomas handled most financial matters while he was alive. Before his death, he assured me everything was organized and protected. After that conversation, I rarely thought about it again. Richard paused before speaking. "There have been rumors," he said carefully. "Nothing confirmed. But I have heard that certain people have been asking questions about ownership structures, succession rights, and property transfers." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. Suddenly, every strange conversation, every awkward family gathering, every cold glance from Vanessa seemed connected by an invisible thread. This was not about hurt feelings. This was not about personality conflicts. There was a reason they wanted distance between me and the rest of the family. There was a reason I had become unwelcome. That evening, I opened the safe in my bedroom closet. Inside were documents Thomas had instructed me never to throw away. Insurance papers, old deeds, letters, legal folders. I spent hours sorting through them. Near the bottom, beneath several years of records, I discovered a sealed envelope with my name written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I held it. Dust clung to the edges. The envelope looked untouched for years. I stared at it for a long moment before finally placing it on the table beside me. Whatever answers I was searching for, I suddenly felt certain they were waiting inside. And for the first time since that humiliating night at the restaurant, I realized I might not be the only person hiding a secret. For several minutes, I simply stared at the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas had always written my name the same way, carefully and neatly, as though every letter mattered. Seeing it again brought back memories I had spent years trying not to revisit. I finally opened the seal and unfolded the documents inside. The first page was a letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the words remained clear. Thomas began by telling me that if I was reading the letter, circumstances had likely changed in ways neither of us would have wanted. That sentence alone made my chest tighten. He went on to explain that during the final years of his life, he had become concerned about pressures that could emerge within the family after he was gone. He never named anyone directly. That was not his style. Instead, he wrote about human nature, about how grief sometimes revealed qualities that remained hidden during easier times, about how money could distort judgment, about how loyalty should never be assumed simply because people shared the same last name. I read every line twice. Then I turned to the documents attached behind the letter. The legal language was complicated, but one fact became immediately clear. Thomas had established protections years earlier. The family trust was far more significant than I had realized. Certain assets, including property holdings and investment accounts, were structured in a way that prevented anyone from making major decisions without specific conditions being met. More surprisingly, those conditions involved me directly. I sat back in my chair, stunned. For 3 years I had believed I was simply living quietly on savings and survivor benefits. Meanwhile, Thomas had left behind a framework designed to preserve the family's future. And according to the documents in front of me, that framework could not be altered without my knowledge. Suddenly Richard's warning made perfect sense. So did Claire's concern. So did Vanessa's growing hostility. If someone wanted control over those assets, my presence represented a problem. Not because I was wealthy, not because I was powerful, but because I stood between ambition and opportunity. The realization settled over me slowly. I thought back to dozens of conversations from the past 2 years. Vanessa encouraging Ryan to consider modernizing family finances. Ryan asking questions about ownership documents he had never previously cared about. Invitations becoming less frequent. Family discussions occurring without me. Each memory now carried a different meaning. Around 6 o'clock that evening, my phone buzzed. It was Ryan. His name appeared on the screen for the first time since the restaurant incident. I let the call ring twice before answering. His voice sounded unusually careful. He asked how I was doing. The question felt rehearsed. We exchanged polite words for a minute before he mentioned that he and Vanessa were planning a small family gathering the following weekend. Then he said something that immediately captured my attention. There are a few important matters we should probably discuss as a family. Important matters. The phrase lingered in my mind. I agreed to attend without hesitation. Ryan sounded relieved. After the call ended, I remained seated at the kitchen table, looking out toward the darkening backyard. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not because my problems had disappeared, not because the situation had improved, but because uncertainty was finally giving way to understanding. They believed I knew nothing. They believed I would continue accepting whatever version of reality they chose to present. I folded Thomas's letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. Then I placed the documents back inside the safe. Outside, the evening sky faded from blue to gray. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across a neighboring yard. Everything felt ordinary. Yet deep down I knew something important had changed. The next family gathering would not be like the last one. This time, I would be arriving with answers. The week passed more quickly than I expected. Every morning, I followed the same routine, But underneath the ordinary rhythm of daily life, I felt a growing sense of purpose. For too long, I had been reacting to events without understanding them. Now I finally possessed pieces of the truth. I did not know the entire picture yet, but I knew enough to recognize that the upcoming family gathering was important. 3 days before the event, I received another call from Claire. This time her voice carried a greater sense of urgency. She asked if we could meet in person. We arranged to have coffee at a small cafe on the edge of town, a quiet place where few people paid attention to anyone except their own conversations. When I arrived, Claire was already waiting near the window. The moment I sat down, I could tell something was troubling her. She stirred her coffee without taking a sip. Her eyes kept moving toward the door as though she wanted to be certain we were alone. Finally, she leaned forward. "There is something I probably should have told you sooner," she said softly. I listened without interrupting. Claire explained that over the past several months, she had attended multiple family gatherings where my future had become a topic of discussion. At first, she assumed everyone was simply concerned about my well-being. The conversations sounded reasonable. Questions about whether I was lonely, whether maintaining a large house was becoming difficult, whether I might be happier living somewhere with more support. But eventually the tone changed. According to Claire, the discussions became less about helping me and more about removing obstacles. The word obstacle stayed with me. It felt cold, impersonal, as though I were no longer a member of the family, but a problem waiting to be solved. Claire lowered her voice even further. She told me she had overheard Vanessa speaking privately with several relatives after a birthday party months earlier. Vanessa had expressed frustration that certain financial decisions could not move forward because of outdated arrangements. At the time, Claire did not understand what that meant. Now she suspected it involved the trust Thomas had created. I remained calm while she spoke, but inside my thoughts were racing. Every new detail fit perfectly beside the documents hidden in my safe. Claire then revealed something even more troubling. The gathering Ryan mentioned was not merely a family dinner. Vanessa had been encouraging relatives to attend because she planned to discuss long-term family planning. The phrase sounded harmless on the surface. Yet Claire believed the real purpose was something else entirely. She believed Vanessa intended to pressure me into agreeing to changes involving property and financial control. When our conversation ended, Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I know this is difficult," she said, "but I wanted you to walk into that room knowing what might happen." I thanked her and drove home in silence. That evening, I sat on my back porch watching the sun sink below the trees. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere nearby, children laughed as they played basketball in a driveway. The normal sounds of life felt strangely comforting. I thought about Thomas, about the trust he had placed in me, about the precautions he had taken years before anyone else saw trouble coming. For the first time, I understood why he left those instructions behind. He knew that character reveals itself most clearly when people believe something valuable is within reach. 2 days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a formal invitation to the family gathering. The wording was polite, warm even. Anyone reading it would assume it came from a loving family hoping to spend time together. I studied the elegant lettering for several seconds before setting it aside. Then I opened my desk drawer and removed a small notebook. On the first page, I began writing down every fact I had learned during the past week. Every conversation, every document, every warning. By the time I finished, one thing had become unmistakably clear. Whatever happened at that gathering, it would not be spontaneous. Plans had already been made. Expectations had already been formed. The only surprise waiting in that room was that I would not be arriving unprepared. The day of the gathering arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air. I woke early and spent the morning moving through my usual routine with deliberate calm. I made breakfast, watered the flowers near the front porch, and reviewed the notes I had collected during the previous week. There was no anxiety left, only focus. Whatever happened that afternoon, I intended to listen more than I spoke. By 2 o'clock, I was driving toward the country club where the gathering was being held. Ryan had chosen a private room overlooking a small lake. It was the sort of place families selected when they wanted an event to feel important. As I walked through the entrance, I immediately noticed how many relatives had been invited. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends filled the room. Several people greeted me warmly. Others seemed uncomfortable. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Those reactions told me more than words ever could. Vanessa stood near the center of the room, speaking confidently with a small group of relatives. The moment she saw me arrive, her expression changed. The smile remained, but something colder appeared behind it. Ryan approached and gave me a quick hug. His movements felt nervous. He asked how I had been. I told him I was doing well. The conversation lasted less than a minute before he excused himself to speak with someone else. Once again, I found myself standing alone. An hour later, after lunch had been served and conversations settled into a comfortable rhythm, Vanessa rose from her chair. She thanked everyone for coming and began discussing family plans. At first, her remarks sounded harmless. She spoke about the importance of preparing for the future. She talked about efficiency, responsibility, and long-term stability. Several relatives nodded along. Then she gradually shifted the conversation toward property ownership and estate planning. I remained silent. Vanessa explained that maintaining large homes could become difficult as people grew older. She suggested that families sometimes needed to make practical decisions for the benefit of everyone involved. Her eyes drifted toward me more than once. The message was obvious. Eventually, she produced a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. Ryan looked surprised, though not entirely. It seemed he knew part of the plan, but perhaps not all of it. Vanessa explained that she had consulted professionals regarding possible restructuring options for certain family assets. She spoke confidently, almost as if the outcome had already been decided. Then she turned toward me directly. "We all want what is best for you, Evelyn," she said. "And we believe this could simplify things moving forward." The room became very quiet. I glanced around the table. Some relatives appeared uncomfortable. Others looked curious. No one spoke. Vanessa slid several documents toward me. "There is no pressure," she added with a smile that felt carefully practiced. "We simply thought you might want to review these." I looked down at the papers without touching them. Then I looked back up. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. In that silence, I realized something important. Vanessa truly believed she understood the entire situation. She believed every variable had been accounted for, every conversation planned, every obstacle removed. What she did not realize was that the most important information in the room belonged to me. I folded my hands calmly and thanked her for her concern. Then I asked a simple question. "Before we discuss any changes, has everyone here been informed about the original trust provisions Thomas established?" The effect was immediate. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. Ryan's expression changed. Vanessa's confident smile faltered for the first time all afternoon. And in that moment, I knew the balance of the conversation had begun to shift. For a moment, nobody spoke. The quiet that followed my question seemed to settle over the entire room. I could hear the faint sound of water moving across the lake outside the windows and the distant clink of dishes from another dining area. Vanessa recovered first. She gave a small laugh and folded her arms. "I am not sure what that has to do with today's discussion," she said. Her tone remained polite, but the confidence she had displayed earlier was beginning to crack. I looked around the table before answering. "It has everything to do with today's discussion," I said calmly. Several relatives leaned forward. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Ryan shifted in his chair. For the first time that afternoon, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable. "Mom," he said carefully, "what exactly are you talking about?" I met his eyes. There was a time when I could read every thought crossing my son's face. Now I was no longer certain. Still, I recognized confusion when I saw it. Whatever Vanessa had told him, she had not told him everything. "I am talking about the legal structure your father created years ago," I replied. "The same structure that protects certain family assets." Vanessa immediately interrupted. "Those arrangements are outdated. Everyone knows that." The speed of her response revealed more than she intended. I turned toward her. "Have you actually read the original documents?" I asked. Her expression hardened. She did not answer. Instead, she glanced briefly toward Ryan. That single look told me enough. She had been operating on assumptions. Dangerous assumptions. One of my cousins finally spoke. "What trust are we talking about?" he asked. Another relative nodded. Soon several people were asking similar questions. The conversation that Vanessa had carefully planned was slipping away from her. Instead of discussing the future she wanted, everyone suddenly wanted to understand the past. Ryan looked increasingly uneasy. "I thought Dad left everything to you," he said. "That is what I always believed. That is what many people believed," I answered. "But your father was a careful man. He planned for situations most people never imagine. Vanessa opened the folder in front of her and began flipping through pages. Her movements were quicker now, less controlled. Regardless of old paperwork, she said, we are simply trying to make practical decisions. Surely everyone agrees that efficiency matters. The room remained silent. The support she expected was not appearing. People were listening now, thinking, asking questions. The atmosphere had changed completely. Then another voice entered the conversation. Richard Hale stepped into the room. I had invited him, quietly 2 days earlier. He was not a dramatic man. He did not need to be. His reputation spoke for itself. Several relatives recognized him immediately. Ryan stood up. Richard, he asked. Richard offered a polite nod before taking a seat near the end of the table. Vanessa looked genuinely startled. For the first time all afternoon, she appeared uncertain. Richard placed a thin leather portfolio on the table. Evelyn asked me to attend in case clarification became necessary, he said. His voice remained calm and professional. Based on the direction of this discussion, I believe clarification may indeed be necessary. Nobody interrupted him. He opened the portfolio and removed several documents. Even from across the table, I recognized the familiar pages. They were copies of the same materials Thomas had prepared years earlier. Ryan stared at them. Vanessa stared even harder. The confidence that had carried her through the beginning of the gathering was gone now, replaced by concern. Real concern. Richard adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. Before anyone makes decisions regarding family property, ownership rights, or trust assets, he said, there are several facts everyone should understand. As he prepared to continue, I noticed something I had not seen in months. Ryan was no longer looking at Vanessa. He was looking at me. Richard allowed the silence to linger before speaking. Years of experience had taught him that people listen more carefully when they were forced to sit with uncertainty. He opened the first document and looked around the room. Thomas Carter established this trust nearly 15 years ago, he said. Its purpose was not only to preserve family assets, but also to ensure that major decisions would be guided by long-term stability rather than short-term pressure. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. Most had never heard these details before. Ryan remained focused on the papers in front of Richard. Vanessa sat perfectly still. Richard continued. He explained that the trust included the family home, several investment accounts, and ownership interests connected to properties Thomas had acquired over decades of careful planning. More importantly, certain decisions required approval from a designated trustee. I already knew what was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud still carried weight. Thomas named Evelyn as primary trustee, Richard said. A murmur spread through the room. Ryan blinked several times. Vanessa stared directly at Richard. That cannot be correct, she said immediately. Richard calmly slid a certified copy across the table. It is entirely correct. No one spoke after that. Vanessa picked up the document and scanned the page. Her expression changed with every line she read. The assumptions she had built over months were collapsing one by one. The room felt smaller somehow. He then explained another provision. If any beneficiary attempted to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence trust decisions, their authority regarding future recommendations could be restricted under review procedures established by Thomas himself. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Thomas had anticipated conflict. He had planned accordingly. Ryan finally broke the silence. Why did Dad never tell me any of this? He asked quietly. Richard looked at him with genuine sympathy. Because he hoped it would never become necessary. Those words seemed to strike harder than anything else said that afternoon. Ryan lowered his eyes. For the first time, I saw regret begin to replace confusion. He was replaying conversations, remembering decisions, connecting dots he had ignored for too long. Vanessa attempted to regain control of the discussion. She argued that everyone had simply been trying to help. She insisted no one intended harm. Yet the confidence was gone from her voice. Every statement sounded defensive now. The relatives who had nodded along earlier were no longer supporting her. Instead, they were asking questions. Practical questions. Honest questions. Questions that exposed how little anyone actually knew about the trust. For nearly an hour, Richard answered them patiently. By the end, the situation looked very different from the one Vanessa had imagined. No documents would be signed. No restructuring would occur. No decisions would be rushed. Every proposed change would require proper review under the existing terms established by Thomas. As the meeting slowly came to an end, people began gathering their belongings. Conversations remained quiet, thoughtful, reflective. The energy in the room had completely changed. Before leaving, several relatives approached me individually. Some offered support. Others admitted they had misunderstood the situation. A few simply thanked me for remaining calm. Through it all, Vanessa remained seated. She barely spoke. Ryan stayed beside her, but seemed miles away in his thoughts. As I prepared to leave, he finally stood and walked toward me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked a question that revealed just how much had changed. "Mom," he said softly, "how long have you known?" I looked at him for several seconds before answering. Long enough to stop being surprised. His shoulders sank slightly. He nodded without argument. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected across the lake. The water shimmered beneath the fading light. As I walked toward my car, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not victory, not satisfaction, something quieter. Clarity. The truth was finally visible to everyone. And once people see the truth clearly, they can never completely unsee it. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and the world outside my window slowly returned to life. The maple tree in my front yard filled with new leaves. Flowers bloomed along the walkway Thomas and I planted years ago. Life moved forward the way it always does, quietly and without asking permission. The family gathering at the country club became a turning point none of us could ignore. Once the facts were known, conversations changed. Assumptions disappeared. The rumors and half-truths that had circulated for months could no longer survive beside documented reality. I did not make dramatic announcements. I did not seek revenge. I simply continued living my life. The trust remained intact. The assets remained protected. And every future decision followed the process Thomas had carefully established years earlier. What surprised me most was not how people reacted to the truth. It was how they reacted once the pressure was gone. Relatives who had avoided me began calling again. Some apologized directly. Others expressed regret in quieter ways. A handwritten note, a phone call, an invitation to lunch. I accepted some. I declined others. Not out of bitterness. Simply because I had learned that reconciliation requires sincerity, not obligation. Ryan called regularly now. At first the conversations were awkward. He often sounded as though he was searching for the right words. One afternoon he came to visit. We sat on the back porch drinking iced tea while the neighborhood settled into a warm Saturday evening. For several minutes neither of us spoke about the past. Then he finally looked at me and said something I had waited a long time to hear. "I should have listened to you more." It was not a perfect apology. Life rarely provides those. But it was honest. And honesty matters. I nodded and told him the truth. "I was never asking you to choose sides. I was only asking you to pay attention." He lowered his eyes and quietly admitted that he had ignored things he should have questioned. We sat in silence after that. The kind of silence that heals instead of hurts. As for Vanessa, her relationship with the family changed significantly. People became more cautious, more observant. Trust, once damaged, does not instantly return. She remained part of Ryan's life, and I respected that. Their marriage was their responsibility, not mine. I no longer spent energy trying to manage situations beyond my control. That lesson alone brought a surprising amount of peace. One evening, near the beginning of summer, I found myself standing in the living room holding the photograph from Ryan and Vanessa's wedding. It was the same picture I had studied months earlier while searching for answers. Back then I saw confusion. Now I saw perspective. Families are complicated. People make mistakes. Some mistakes come from selfishness. Others come from fear. The important thing is recognizing the difference before it is too late. I placed the photograph back on the shelf and walked toward the window. Outside, children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Neighbors waved to one another. The ordinary beauty of everyday life continued exactly as it always had. I thought about the restaurant, the humiliation, the secrets, and the long path that followed. Then I thought about Thomas. In the end, the greatest gift he left behind was not financial security. It was wisdom. He understood something many people never learn. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be manipulated into existence. It must be earned through actions, honesty, and character. The people who underestimated me believed strength looked loud. They expected anger, arguments, drama. Instead, strength looked like patience, documentation, calm decisions, quiet dignity. And as the evening sun settled across the yard, I realized something that made me smile. They had spent months trying to remove me from the center of the story. Yet all along, I had been the one holding the final chapter.